Have you ever felt a loneliness so profound? It felt like another presence in the room, a kind of quiet dread that isn't about monsters under the bed, but about the slow, subtle erosion of your own mind. Tonight, I'm sharing a story that delves into that very space, one that comes from the hushed corners of forgotten Reddit threads. A true story, or perhaps a true feeling universally shared in quiet moments. It was a night like many others, the kind where the world outside seemed to dissolve into a monotonous downpour, rain, a steady, relentless drumming against the window pane, the old tin roof groaning under its weight. Inside, the house, too large for one person, felt vast and hollow. Every creak of the aging timbers, every whisper of wind through the ancient window frames, echoed in the profound silence. My own breathing seemed too loud. I lay there, adrift in the cavernous space of my bedroom, the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock downstairs marking the slow, cold passage of time. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, a pervasive emptiness, a chilling solitude, began to weave itself around my thoughts, soft yet suffocating, like a thin, grey silk ribbon slowly tightening, not around my throat, but around the very core of my being. It was a silence that wasn't empty, but pregnant with an unspoken weight. And that's when it began, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as the night deepened and the world outside continued its mournful cry. And that's when it began, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as the night deepened and the world outside continued its mournful cry. The rain persisted, a relentless hush against the windows, a counterpoint to the hollow echo of the old house. I remember the sensation of being caught in that liminal space between wakefulness and the pull of sleep, a state where the edges of reality blur and the mind, untethered, begins to wander. It was then, as my thoughts drifted, softened by the monotonous drum of water and the distant, somber tick-tock, that I heard it, a sound, not from the familiar world outside, nor from the familiar groan of the house settling into its old bones. It was a whisper, impossibly soft, like the barest exhalation of breath, a breath that seemed to brush against the very fabric of the air in my room. It wasn't loud enough to startle, not sharp enough to cut through the quiet, but rather, it unfurled within it, a delicate ripple in the oppressive stillness. It seemed to emanate from the wall directly opposite my bed, a wall adorned with an antique tapestry that had long ago faded into muted greens and browns, now just a shadowy expanse in the dim light. I blinked, my eyelids feeling heavy, trying to discern if the sound was truly external or merely a phantom echo within the chambers of my own skull. The human mind, after all, is a master of illusion, especially when suspended in the pre-sleep haze. Could it be the wind, sighing through a hidden fissure in the plaster, mimicking a human sound, or the house, in its deep, ancient slumber? Finally speaking in tongues, the whisper was fleeting, a mere ghost of a sound. Just as I tried to pinpoint its origin, to lean into it with a more focused ear, it dissolved. The silence returned, not the comforting silence of a quiet night, but a silence that felt heavier, imbued with the lingering ghost of what I thought I had heard. It pressed down, a blanket woven from absence, making the subtle creaks of the floorboards and the distant rain seem amplified, almost frantic in their mundane regularity. I shifted, the old mattress groaning beneath me, a sound that in itself could be misinterpreted in the dark. My breath hitched, not in fear, but in a peculiar sense of heightened awareness. My eyes, accustomed to the gloom, now scanned the wall, searching for any visual cue, a tremor in the tapestry, a shadow that moved. There was nothing, just the aged plaster, the faded patterns, the quiet steadfastness of something inanimate. Yet the imprint of that almost sound remained, a subtle vibration within my inner ear, a memory of a sound that perhaps never truly was. I closed my eyes, willing myself to dismiss it as a product of an overactive imagination, a dream fragment bleeding into consciousness. The mind, yearning for explanation, quickly offered rationalizations. The house was old, full of peculiar acoustics. The wind was strong tonight, finding new ways to sing its melancholic tune. But even as these thoughts formed, a tiny thread of unease began to unravel in the quiet corners of my mind. It wasn't a panicked dread, but a slow, insidious seep of doubt. What if it wasn't the wind? What if it wasn't my imagination? The possibility, slender as it was, began to settle. I lay perfectly still, my breathing shallow, trying to recapture that elusive sound. My senses felt acutely sharpened. Every distant drop of rain, every rustle of the leaves outside, every faint pulse of my own blood in my ears became a focal point. I strained, listening with an intensity that verged on painful, for any repetition, any confirmation. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The clock continued its relentless march, indifferent to my internal vigil. The rain, a steady companion, offered no secrets. And then, just as the tension in my shoulders began to relax, just as the rationalizations started to take firmer hold, it came again. This time, it was even softer, a mere suggestion of sound, a fragile whisper of air that seemed to carry the barest intimation of a voice. It wasn't words, not distinct syllables, but a delicate, almost melodic hum, a soft, protracted sigh, so subtle it could easily be mistaken for the whisper of the wind against the glass, or the gentle settling of dust motes in the quiet air. Yet, there was an intimacy to it, a resonance that felt human. It was so close, so intimately soft, that it felt as though someone had leaned in from the other side of that old wall and exhaled gently, right into my ear. My heart gave a faint, almost imperceptible flutter. Not a panicked thump, but a quiet, internal tremor. Like a moth trapped lightly between cupped hands. My eyes were wide open now, fixed on the tapestry, on the unyielding surface of the plaster. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest intake of air might dissipate this spectral sound. The air in the room, previously just cool, now felt as though it had thinned, carrying with it a faint, almost metallic tang, like the taste of old pennies on the tongue. It was a sensation that prickled the back of my throat, an unidentifiable anomaly in the familiar comfort of my bedroom. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, a deep, heavy quietude that absorbed every other sound, leaving only the echo of that faint, impossible whisper. There was no discernible crack in the plaster, no obvious source. The wall stood solid, unwavering, a barrier of brick and mortar that ought to offer impenetrable silence. Yet, the sound had passed through it, or perhaps had been generated by it. The notion that the very structure of the house could harbour such a soft, breathing presence was unsettling in a way that overt horror could never achieve. It wasn't a threat. It was an encroachment, a subtle blurring of boundaries between the inanimate and the animate, between the external and the internal. I lay there for a long time, listening to the rain, to the clock, to the beat of my own heart, now a more regular, if still somewhat cautious, rhythm. Sleep was no longer a possibility. The quiet solitude of the night, once a comforting blanket, had now become a vast, echoing chamber, punctuated by an unheard whisper. And in that vastness, a subtle shift had occurred. The house, which had always felt like an extension of myself, familiar and benign, now seemed to hold a secret, a quiet, breathing mystery woven into its very walls. The journey into the profound loneliness had taken an unexpected turn, leading me not into deeper silence, but into a silence that hummed with a spectral, unheard resonance. The spectral, unheard resonance of the whisper had settled deep within me, not as a piercing shriek of fear, but as a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. Sleep, when it eventually came, was shallow, fragmented by the mind's restless churn, replaying the near sound, questioning its reality. The quiet nights that followed were no longer mere stretches of time, but elongated vigils. Each moment waited with an unspoken expectation, a subtle readiness for the improbable to manifest once more. The rain, once a monotonous lullaby, now felt like a constant companion, its drumming against the panes a rhythmic backdrop to my heightened senses. I found myself listening more intently, not just for specific sounds, but for the absence of sound, for the subtle shifts in the air, the whispers that might again bloom from the silence. The house, usually a benign presence, seemed to expand around me, its old timbers groaning with a deeper, more resonant voice, as if it too were holding its breath, listening. It was during one of these prolonged nights, a night when the moon, a slender sliver of silver, managed to pierce through the persistent cloud cover, casting elongated, dancing shadows across my room, that the visual intrusion began. I was lying in bed, ostensibly reading by the soft glow of a bedside lamp, though my eyes often drifted from the page, drawn instead to the periphery of my vision, to the dimly lit corners of the room. The air was still, cool against my skin, and the only sound was the distant sigh of the wind and the muted thump-thump of my own heart against the pillow. And then, it happened. Not with a jolt, not with a sudden, horrifying appearance, but with a grace so subtle, so fleeting, that it might have been a trick of the tired eye, a ripple in the fabric of the shadows themselves, a movement, not a distinct shape, not a figure with discernible limbs or features, but merely movement, a dark, amorphous smudge, a deeper shade within the existing gloom, seemed to detach itself from the edge of the doorway, just at the very precipice of my peripheral sight. It was a swift, almost liquid dart, a silent displacement of air, an instantaneous vanishing act. My head snapped around, my muscles tensing involuntarily, a quick, sharp intake of breath freezing in my throat. My gaze, now direct, swept across the empty doorway, then down the short stretch of hallway visible from my bed. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The shadows lay undisturbed, clinging to the corners of the ceiling, pooling beneath the antique console table in the hall. The air was still, utterly devoid of any recent disturbance. The silence was complete, save for the rhythmic patter of rain, now sounding almost accusatory in its steadfast normalcy. I blinked, hard, rubbing my eyes with the heel of my hand. The familiar ache of sleeplessness throbbed behind my eyelids. Fatigue. I rationalized. Pure, unadulterated fatigue. My mind, ever the diligent architect of logic, began to construct explanations the play of moonlight through the bare branches outside, magnified and distorted by the old window panes. A moth, dark and quick, flitting past the edge of my vision, the inherent trickery of the peripheral field, notorious for creating phantom shapes. These thoughts were comforting, like warm stones pressed against a chill, but their warmth didn't quite penetrate the thin veneer of unease that had already begun to form. I tried to return to my book, but the words blurred, their meaning lost in the afterimage of that non-existent shadow. My eyes, however, no longer lingered on the page. They began a new, involuntary dance, constantly darting to the edges of my vision, searching, anticipating. My peripheral awareness felt stretched, almost painfully sensitive. Every tiny shift in light or shadow now magnified, scrutinized. The next night, the phenomenon repeated itself. This time, I wasn't reading. I was simply lying awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in the soft echo of the rain. My eyes were fixed upwards, but my awareness was not. It was a strange duality. My central vision focused on the familiar ceiling, while my peripheral vision, like a separate entity, seemed to be independently scanning the room. And again, there it was, a subtle, quick sliver of dark, moving with an impossible fluidity, just at the edge of the hallway, near the old grandfather clock that rarely chimed anymore. My head turned, slower this time, almost hesitantly, as if reluctant to confirm the emptiness I knew I would find. And indeed, there was nothing. The hallway stretched, narrow and silent, into the deeper darkness of the house. The grandfather clock stood sentinel, its dark wood impassive, reflecting the meager light from my room. The air around it was still, inert. This recurrence, however subtle, began to chip away at the robust fortress of my rationality. One instance could be a trick of the light, a figment of a weary mind. But two instances, separated by hours, occurring in different parts of my peripheral field, yet carrying the same ephemeral, shapeless quality. This was harder to dismiss. It wasn't menacing, not in the overt jump scare sense. It was insinuating, like a whisper. It suggested a presence without overtly stating it. A silent question mark hung in the air. A peculiar sensation began to cling to me, a subtle prickling along the nape of my neck, the kind one feels when sensing an unseen gaze. It wasn't a burning, intrusive stare, but a lighter, almost gentle observation, like the brushing of a cobweb against the skin. Barely there, yet undeniably present. I started to find myself subtly reorienting my position, turning my back less often to the open doorways, unconsciously arranging my line of sight to include more of the room's boundaries. The shadow never materialized directly. It was always a fleeting glimpse, always at the extreme edge of my visual field, just beyond the reach of conscious, direct perception. It was a shape that refused to take shape, a presence that existed only in the instantaneous aftermath of its vanishing. This evasiveness was, perhaps, its most potent weapon. It didn't allow for confrontation, for investigation, only for a perpetual state of almost seeing. A maddening dance between what might be and what undeniably isn't. I found myself holding my breath more often, my body tensing imperceptibly, my eyes widening slightly as I scanned the shadows, hoping to catch it, to pin it down with a direct stare, to expose it for the trick of light or dust motes that it surely was. But it remained elusive, a phantom that danced only on the very fringes of my awareness. The silence of the house began to feel less like peaceful solitude and more like a vast, empty canvas upon which these fleeting images were projected. My mind, restless and alert, worked overtime, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was experiencing with the mundane reality of my surroundings. Was I simply aging, my vision faltering, creating these retinal anomalies, or was something else at play? Something that understood the subtle vulnerabilities of human perception, exploiting the very architecture of my sight. This persistent, almost gentle intrusion started to weave itself into the fabric of my nights. The idea of being alone in the old house, once comforting, now carried a new, delicate layer of unease. It wasn't the fear of a lurking predator, not the dread of overt danger. It was something far more insidious, a gradual erosion of my confidence in my own senses, a quiet dismantling of the solidity of my perceived reality. The feeling was akin to walking through a perpetually shifting curtain of fine gauze. You feel its touch, you know it's there, but you can never quite grasp it, never truly see its defined form. It was a subtle, almost tender torment, a slow, gentle unraveling. The world around me, my home, my familiar spaces, began to hum with a quiet, unseen activity, a presence that declared itself only through these fleeting, shapeless gestures at the very edges of my sight. And with each unconfirmed glimpse, each failed attempt to catch it in the act, the thread of unease tightened, not into a chokehold, but into a subtle, persistent pull, drawing me deeper into the quiet, unsettling embrace of the unknown. My vision, once a reliable anchor in my waking world, had now become a gateway to doubt, a window through which something shapeless, yet undeniably there, seemed to be peeking in. The spectral, unheard resonance of the whisper had settled deep within me, not as a piercing shriek of fear, but as a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. Sleep, when it eventually came, was shallow, fragmented by the mind's restless churn, replaying the near sound, questioning its reality. The quiet nights that followed were no longer mere stretches of time, but elongated vigils, each moment weighted with an unspoken expectation, a subtle readiness for the improbable to manifest once more. The rain, once a monotonous lullaby, now felt like a constant companion, its drumming against the panes a rhythmic backdrop to my heightened senses. I found myself listening more intently, not just for specific sounds, but for the absence of sound, for the subtle shifts in the air, the whispers that might again bloom from the silence. The house, usually a benign presence, seemed to expand around me, its old timbers groaning with a deeper, more resonant voice, as if it too were holding its breath, listening. It was during one of these prolonged nights, a night when the moon, a slender sliver of silver, managed to pierce through the persistent cloud cover, casting elongated, dancing shadows across my room, that the visual intrusion began. I was lying in bed, ostensibly reading by the soft glow of a bedside lamp, though my eyes often drifted from the page, drawn instead to the periphery of my vision, to the dimly lit corners of the room. The air was still, cool against my skin, and the only sound was the distant sigh of the wind and the muted thump-thump of my own heart against the pillow. And then it happened, not with a jolt, not with a sudden, horrifying appearance, but with a grace so subtle, so fleeting, that it might have been a trick of the tired eye, a ripple in the fabric of the shadows themselves, a movement, not a distinct shape, not a figure with discernible limbs or features, but merely movement. A dark, amorphous smudge, a deeper shade within the existing gloom, seemed to detach itself from the edge of the doorway, just at the very precipice of my peripheral sight. It was a swift, almost liquid dart, a silent displacement of air, an instantaneous vanishing act. My head snapped around, my muscles tensing involuntarily, a quick, sharp intake of breath freezing in my throat. My gaze, now direct, swept across the empty doorway, then down the short stretch of hallway visible from my bed. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The shadows lay undisturbed, clinging to the corners of the ceiling, pooling beneath the antique console table in the hall. The air was still, utterly devoid of any recent disturbance. The silence was complete, save for the rhythmic patter of rain, now sounding almost accusatory in its steadfast normalcy. I blinked, hard, rubbing my eyes with the heel of my hand. The familiar ache of sleeplessness throbbed behind my eyelids. Fatigue. I rationalized. Pure, unadulterated fatigue. My mind, ever the diligent architect of logic, began to construct explanations the play of moonlight through the bare branches outside, magnified and distorted by the old window panes. A moth, dark and quick, flitting past the edge of my vision, the inherent trickery of the peripheral field, notorious for creating phantom shapes. These thoughts were comforting, like warm stones pressed against a chill, but their warmth didn't quite penetrate the thin veneer of unease that had already begun to form. I tried to return to my book, but the words blurred, their meaning lost in the afterimage of that non-existent shadow. My eyes, however, no longer lingered on the page. They began a new, involuntary dance, constantly darting to the edges of my vision, searching, anticipating. My peripheral awareness felt stretched, almost painfully sensitive. Every tiny shift in light or shadow now magnified, scrutinized. The next night, the phenomenon repeated itself. This time, I wasn't reading. I was simply lying awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in the soft echo of the rain. My eyes were fixed upwards, but my awareness was not. It was a strange duality. My central vision focused on the familiar ceiling, while my peripheral vision, like a separate entity, seemed to be independently scanning the room. And again, there it was, a subtle, quick sliver of dark, moving with an impossible fluidity, just at the edge of the hallway, near the old grandfather clock that rarely chimed anymore. My head turned, slower this time, almost hesitantly, as if reluctant to confirm the emptiness I knew I would find. And indeed, there was nothing. The hallway stretched, narrow and silent, into the deeper darkness of the house. The grandfather clock stood sentinel, its dark wood impassive, reflecting the meager light from my room. The air around it was still, inert. This recurrence, however subtle, began to chip away at the robust fortress of my rationality. One instance could be a trick of the light, a figment of a weary mind, but two instances, separated by hours, occurring in different parts of my peripheral field, yet carrying the same ephemeral, shapeless quality. This was harder to dismiss. It wasn't menacing, not in the overt, jump scare sense. It was insinuating, like a whisper. It suggested a presence without overtly stating it. A silent question mark hung in the air. A peculiar sensation began to cling to me. A subtle prickling along the nape of my neck, the kind one feels when sensing an unseen gaze. It wasn't a burning, intrusive stare, but a lighter, almost gentle observation, like the brushing of a cobweb against the skin, barely there, yet undeniably present. I started to find myself subtly reorienting my position, turning my back less often to the open doorways, unconsciously arranging my line of sight to include more of the room's boundaries. The shadow never materialized directly. It was always a fleeting glimpse, always at the extreme edge of my visual field, just beyond the reach of conscious, direct perception. It was a shape that refused to take shape, a presence that existed only in the instantaneous aftermath of its vanishing. This evasiveness was, perhaps, its most potent weapon. It didn't allow for confrontation, for investigation, only for a perpetual state of almost seeing, a maddening dance between what might be and what undeniably isn't. I found myself holding my breath more often, my body tensing imperceptibly, my eyes widening slightly as I scanned the shadows, hoping to catch it, to pin it down with a direct stare, to expose it for the trick of light or dust motes that it surely was. But it remained elusive, a phantom that danced only on the very fringes of my awareness. The silence of the house began to feel less like peaceful solitude, and more like a vast, empty canvas upon which these fleeting images were projected. My mind, restless and alert, worked overtime, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was experiencing with the mundane reality of my surroundings. Was I simply aging, my vision faltering, creating these retinal anomalies, or was something else at play? Something that understood the subtle vulnerabilities of human perception, exploiting the very architecture of my sight. This persistent, almost gentle intrusion started to weave itself into the fabric of my nights. The idea of being alone in the old house, once comforting, now carried a new, delicate layer of unease. It wasn't the fear of a lurking predator, Not the dread of overt danger. It was something far more insidious. A gradual erosion of my confidence in my own senses. A quiet dismantling of the solidity of my perceived reality. The feeling was akin to walking through a perpetually shifting curtain of fine gauze. You feel its touch. You know it's there, but you can never quite grasp it, never truly see its defined form. It was a subtle, almost tender torment, a slow, gentle unraveling. The world around me, my home, my familiar spaces, began to hum with a quiet, unseen activity. A presence that declared itself only through these fleeting, shapeless gestures at the very edges of my sight. And with each unconfirmed glimpse, each failed attempt to catch it in the act, the thread of unease tightened, not into a chokehold, but into a subtle, persistent pull, drawing me deeper into the quiet, unsettling embrace of the unknown. My vision, once a reliable anchor in my waking world, had now become a gateway to doubt, a window through which something shapeless, yet undeniably there seemed to be peeking in. The days that followed blurred into a quiet continuum, each one permeated by the phantom shadows that danced at the periphery of my sight, and the unheard whispers that seemed to vibrate just beyond the threshold of my hearing. The rain continued its ceaseless drumming, a constant, low thrum against the windows, a soundtrack to my growing inner dissonance. My senses felt both hyper-alert and strangely dulled, simultaneously seeking out the inexplicable while struggling to process the mundane. My reality, once a sturdy, well-defined structure, now felt porous, as though subtle fissures were appearing in its very foundations, allowing the unsettling and the uncanny to seep through. It was on one such morning, a morning indistinguishable from many others, that this subtle erosion extended its reach to another, more primal sense, my sense of smell. My routine, a comforting anchor in the shifting currents of my thoughts, began with the quiet ritual of preparing tea. The warm, earthy aroma of my usual blend had always been a source of simple pleasure, a fragrant promise of familiarity and comfort. I boiled the water, the gentle hum of the kettle a familiar sound, and watched the steam curl delicately from the spout before pouring it over the tea leaves in my favorite mug. As the hot water infused the leaves, the first wisp of steam carried the familiar, comforting scent of bergamot and black tea. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my palms, inhaling deeply, allowing the fragrance to settle my frayed nerves. But then, a subtle discord struck me. Beneath the crisp, familiar notes of my tea, another scent began to emerge, faint at first, then growing steadily, weaving itself into the expected aroma with an almost malignant grace. It was a smell that shouldn't be there, a scent utterly alien to the fragrant steam. It was an old smell, not merely old, in the sense of something aged and cherished, but old in a deeply unsettling way, a scent of decay, of dampness clinging to forgotten things, a persistent damp earthiness mingled with the dry, brittle aroma of dust and disuse. It was the smell of a forgotten attic, of books left unread for decades in a dank cellar, of fabric that had absorbed the quiet rot of time, a heavy, musty sweetness that clung to the air, an olfactory stain. My brow furrowed. I pulled the mug closer, inhaling again, more cautiously this time. Yes, It was undeniable. The familiar warmth of the tea was there, but now it felt like a fragile veil over this deeper, more pervasive scent. It was like tasting something delicious, only to find an acrid, metallic aftertaste that lingered, tainting the entire experience. This wasn't merely a faint undertone. It was a character, an entity, asserting itself with a quiet, undeniable presence. I looked around my kitchen, a space I knew intimately. The polished wooden surfaces, the neat array of utensils, the subtle scent of fresh bread from yesterday's baking, all seemed normal. Yet, the air itself felt heavy, imbued with this new, unsettling fragrance. I sniffed at the tea leaves in the jar, then at the empty tea bags, but they held only their expected aromas. The scent wasn't emanating from the tea itself, but seemed to be somehow carried by it, drawn out and amplified by the steam, or perhaps simply made apparent through the familiar conduit of my morning ritual. A shiver, colder than any apprehension provoked by the shadows, traced its way down my spine. This was different. My vision, though playing tricks, was always about absence, about fleeting, unconfirmed glimpses. My hearing had given me whispers that were almost not there, but this was a tangible, undeniable presence, a smell that invaded my very breath, that coated the inside of my nostrils and clung to the back of my throat. It was a violation of the most intimate kind, altering my internal landscape, making my body itself feel like a receptacle for something unwelcome. I tried to dismiss it, just as I had the whispers and the shadows. Perhaps the teapot itself, an old ceramic piece, had absorbed some forgotten smell. I washed it thoroughly, scrubbing with hot water and soap, then repeated the tea-making process. The same result, the same pervasive, ancient mustiness, clinging to the warmth of the tea like a parasitic twin. It was not overtly repulsive, not rotten in a stomach-churning way, but rather profoundly old, profoundly alien. A whisper of decay that suggested everything around me was slowly, inexorably, losing its vitality, its freshness. The subtle disruption of my daily ritual became a profound source of unease. Each time I brought the mug to my lips, the encroaching scent would rise to meet me, altering the taste of the tea, transforming a moment of comfort into a quiet confrontation with the unknown. It wasn't just the tea. I began to notice it elsewhere. A faint whiff of that same old damp scent seemed to linger in the corners of rooms, a subtle undercurrent beneath the familiar smells of polish and old wood. It seemed to cling to the curtains, to the fabric of the armchair where I usually read, even to the pages of the books I picked up. My once reliable sense of smell, so deeply intertwined with memory and the comfort of home, was now betraying me. It painted my familiar sanctuary with the brushstrokes of something forgotten, decaying, and deeply strange. The house, which had previously felt like a large, quiet companion, now seemed to possess a hidden, subtle breath of its own, exhaling this ancient, humid perfume. It suggested that something within its very structure was changing, slowly, perhaps imperceptibly to anyone else, but glaringly apparent to my now hypersensitive and profoundly disoriented senses. The insidious nature of this olfactory intrusion was its quiet persistence. It didn't scream for attention. It simply was. It permeated the atmosphere, a gentle, pervasive stain that made everything familiar feel subtly wrong, subtly cold. It was like finding a faded, sepia-tone photograph of a place you know, only to realize the colors, the very essence of it, have been subtly, irrevocably altered. My home, my refuge, was slowly becoming a museum of forgotten things, permeated by the breath of some indistinct, ancient occupant. And I, the sole inhabitant, was left to question not only the reality of what I smelled, but the very sanity of the organ through which I perceived it. Was it the house that was decaying, or was it something within me, slowly unraveling, losing the capacity to distinguish the pure from the tainted, the familiar from the profound and unsettling unknown? The creeping sense of coldness wasn't just in the air, it was settling deep within my bones. A chill derived not from fear, but from the slow, quiet realization that another anchor to my reality had begun to slip. The persistent, ancient scent of damp earth and forgotten things, born from the steam of my morning tea, now permeated more than just the air. It had settled deep within the very fabric of my senses, an unwelcome resident in the sanctuary of my familiar home. It clung to the upholstery, whispered from the pages of old books, and seemed to emanate from the very timbers of the house, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of my awareness. My once reliable nose, formerly a guide to comfort and familiarity, now felt like an instrument of betrayal, tuning me into a decay that seemed to exist just beyond the reach of reason. Days bled into one another, marked only by the monotonous rhythm of the rain outside and the subtle, increasing dissonance within me. The fleeting shadows still danced at the edge of my vision, less alarming now, more like unwelcome, familiar guests. The whispers had faded, or perhaps I had simply stopped straining to hear them, accepting their ephemeral nature. But the scent, the scent remained, a heavy, musty sweetness that coated the inside of my nostrils and seemed to seep into my very bones, lending a profound chill that no amount of warm tea could dispel. It was a coldness that seeped from within, not a physical temperature, but an existential shiver. Sleep, when it came, offered little respite. My dreams were a hazy pastiche of familiar rooms subtly altered, of faces I almost recognized but couldn't quite place, all imbued with that same pervasive, earthy dampness. I would wake feeling more exhausted than when I had fallen asleep, the line between waking and dreaming blurring with each passing night. My body felt heavier, my movement slower, as if I were wading through an unseen current of thick, cold air. My reflection in the occasional window pane showed a face growing paler, more drawn, the eyes shadowed with a fatigue that seemed less about sleep deprivation and more about a profound internal weariness. It was during one such night, when the rain had intensified to a near torrential roar, hammering against the roof and windows with an almost frantic energy, that the mirror became more than just a surface for self-observation. I had risen from bed, drawn by an inexplicable restlessness, a need to simply move, to break the quiet stasis that had settled over me. The house groaned around me, a symphony of creaks and subtle shifts, each sound amplified by the drumming rain, like a vast, living organism stirring in its sleep. I found myself drifting into the small, rarely used bathroom at the end of the hall. The air here was always cooler, carrying a faint, mineral tang. Reaching for the pull cord, I hesitated, choosing instead the dimmer, softer glow of the small nightlight plugged into a low socket. Its weak, yellowish light cast long, wavering shadows, making the familiar space feel cavernous and strangely unfamiliar. My reflection in the old beveled mirror above the sink was a ghost of itself, distorted by the poor light, the edges of my form dissolving into the surrounding gloom. I leaned closer, my elbows resting on the cool porcelain of the sink, and stared. My face stared back, a canvas of pale skin and weary lines. The eyes, usually a calm, steady grey, were now deep pools of shadow, reflecting the dim light like distant, forgotten stars. I lifted a hand, tracing the faint lines around my mouth, a slight furrow in my brow. A sense of detached curiosity washed over me. It was my face, undeniably, yet it felt borrowed, a mask worn thin by time and some invisible abrasion. The rain outside intensified, a deafening cascade, momentarily drowning out all other sounds, pressing against the very walls of the house. In that brief, intense burst of sound, something shifted in the mirror. Not a physical movement, not a tremor in the glass itself, but a profound, almost imperceptible change in the reflection. For a fraction of a second, an impossible, chillingly fleeting instant, the face staring back at me was not my own. It was a face of similar structure, yes, the bone arrangement vaguely familiar, the contours echoing my own, but the details, the very essence of the visage, were profoundly different. The eyes were deeper, perhaps darker, holding a sorrow so ancient, so profound, it seemed to span millennia. The lips were set in a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not one of joy or amusement, but a weary, knowing curve, tinged with an indescribable bitterness. There was an aged quality to the skin, not of wrinkles, but of something worn smooth by countless passing seasons. A surface like old, polished stone. It was a face utterly devoid of any flicker of recognition. A stranger's face, etched with a quiet despair that seemed to predate time itself. The expression lingered for less than a breath, an impossibly brief tableau. Then, as quickly and subtly as it had appeared, it dissolved. The strange, ancient sorrow in the eyes, the bitter, knowing smile, they simply receded, like a ripple smoothing over still water. What remained was my own reflection, my own tired face. Yet now it too seemed imbued with a new, unsettling strangeness. The shadows beneath my eyes seemed deeper, the lines around my mouth more pronounced, as if that fleeting apparition had left an indelible mark, subtly altering the very contours of my being. A sudden, profound coldness, not of the air, but of something far deeper, coursed through me. It was not the sharp, breath-stealing terror of a fright, but a slow, creeping chill that began at the base of my spine and spread outwards, seeping into my limbs, numbing my fingertips. My breath hitched, not in a gasp of fear, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible suspension. My heart, which should have been hammering in my chest, instead felt strangely muted, a distant, slow thud, as if cushioning itself against an impact it couldn't quite comprehend. I stared, unblinking, into the mirror, my own reflection now feeling alien. A stranger staring back with my own weary eyes. Was it a trick of the dim light, a hallucination, born from sleepless nights and the pervasive, disorienting scent that had settled within the house? My mind, usually so keen to rationalize, felt sluggish, unable to construct a coherent explanation. The image had been too vivid, too precise in its fleeting details for mere imagination. The sorrow in those momentary eyes, the weary, ancient smile, they felt profoundly real, more real perhaps than my own fading reflection. I leaned back, away from the glass, as if creating distance could somehow undo what I had just witnessed. My body felt heavy, disconnected from my own will. I pressed my palms against my temples, willing the image away, willing my own familiar self to reassert itself. But the sense of profound dislocation persisted. The face in the mirror, though now undeniably my own, seemed to mock me with its familiarity, its ordinariness. It was my face, yes, but it no longer felt like me. It was a vessel, perhaps, briefly inhabited, now returned to its original weary state, but irrevocably tainted by the presence it had momentarily housed. The thought sent another shiver through me, a deeper, colder current than before. What had I seen? A premonition, a glimpse into a possible future, or a forgotten past? Or had I simply, for a split second, glimpsed the true occupant of this house, the entity that had been whispering from the walls, manifesting as fleeting shadows, and breathing its ancient scent into my tea? Was this a glimpse of its face, briefly superimposed upon my own, a silent assertion of its presence, its ownership? The idea was not terrifying in the conventional sense of monsters or ghosts. It was far more insidious. It was the dawning, unsettling realization that the very essence of self was permeable, fragile, capable of being overwritten. Even for a moment, the boundaries of my own identity, once so solid and undeniable, now felt porous, dissolving under the quiet, relentless pressure of the uncanny. The coldness that had settled in my bones was not the cold of fear, but the deep, bone-deep chill of recognition, a recognition of profound loneliness, of a self slowly eroding, of a fragile identity teetering on the brink of dissolution. I remained there, rooted to the spot, staring into the dim mirror, searching for any lingering trace of the other face, but finding only my own. Yet, my reflection was forever changed. It held a new layer of weariness, a subtle, almost imperceptible hint of that ancient sorrow, that bitter, knowing smile. My hands, still resting on the cold porcelain, felt numb, disconnected. The rain outside continued its relentless drumming, a vast, indifferent sound that seemed to hum in harmony with the profound, unsettling silence that had descended upon my soul. The question was no longer what I had seen, but who I truly was, and how much of that self remained untouched by the slow, quiet corruption that was seeping into every corner of my existence. The sense of detachment was now almost complete. A quiet surrender to the fact that my own reflection had become a stranger. A silent, unsettling testament to a fractured reality. The mirror's cold, reflective surface offered no further revelations, only my own weary face, now a haunting echo of the profound dislocation that had taken root within me. The ancient sorrow, the bitter, knowing smile of the other, unseen face, had etched itself not onto the glass, but onto the very fabric of my perception. I had retreated from the bathroom, not with a hurried flight, but a slow, almost mechanical withdrawal, each step feeling heavy and deliberate, as if I were moving through thick, unseen water. The coldness that had settled in my bones was now a constant companion, a deep, pervasive chill that muted the senses, making the world around me feel distant, softened at the edges. The rain continued its incessant drumming, a rhythmic lullaby that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but within my very skull, harmonizing with the quiet hum of my fragmented reality. Days and nights folded into one another, distinguished only by the varying intensity of the grey light that filtered through the grimy windows. My routine, once a comforting anchor, had become a series of aimless movements, each action imbued with a sense of quiet unreality. I ate, I drank, I slept, but these were simply functions, devoid of genuine engagement. The musty, ancient scent persisted, sometimes stronger, sometimes fading to a mere whisper, but always present, a constant reminder of the unseen presence that seemed to saturate the very air I breathed. My mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, now felt like a sieve, porous and unreliable, struggling to hold onto a consistent narrative of self or surrounding. It began subtly, as all profound changes do in this house, with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the familiar order of things. One afternoon, I reached for the book I had been reading, a worn volume of poetry that usually rested on the small, polished oak table beside my armchair. My fingers met only cool, empty wood, a flicker of annoyance, then confusion. I must have put it somewhere else, I reasoned, my mind already struggling with the clarity of recent memory. I searched the immediate vicinity, under the chair, on the nearby bookshelf, but the book was nowhere to be found. A faint sigh escaped my lips, not of frustration, but of a quiet, growing bewilderment. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I found it resting on my pillow, perfectly centered, spine facing outwards, as if deliberately placed there. There was no one else in the house. There could be no one else. The discovery sent a fresh, cold prickle across my scalp, a sensation distinct from fear, more akin to the unsettling clarity of a profound anomaly. My breath did not catch in a gasp. Instead, it grew shallow, hesitant, as if the very act of breathing might disturb the delicate balance of this new, unsettling order. I picked up the book, its pages cool beneath my fingertips, and examined it for any sign of disturbance, any telltale mark of human touch. There was nothing, just the familiar cover, the comforting weight. I placed it back on the bedside table, precisely where I had intended it to be. The quietness of the house, usually a comfort, now felt like a vast, absorbent silence, ready to swallow any protest, any question. The shifts continued, a quiet, almost playful rearranging of my small, familiar world. A ceramic mug left empty on the kitchen counter after my morning tea would reappear on the dining table, or sometimes perched precariously on a stack of old magazines in the living room. My keys, invariably placed on the small hook by the door, would occasionally be found nestled amongst the teacups in the pantry, or tucked beneath a cushion on the sofa. Each instance was a small, almost imperceptible tremor in the bedrock of my reality, not violent or destructive, but insidious in its quiet subversion. I found myself scrutinizing my own actions with a detached intensity. Had I done this? Had I, in some fleeting moment of absent-mindedness or an unremembered dreamlike state, performed these strange, illogical placements? My mind, however, offered no such answers, only a blank, unsettling void where recollection should have been. The sense of being an unreliable narrator of my own life began to solidify, turning my self-doubt into a quiet, chilling certainty. The internal erosion was now manifesting externally, blurring the lines between my own agency and an unseen, unknown force. There was no sound accompanying these shifts, no telltale creak of a floorboard, no whisper of movement, no soft rustle of displaced fabric, only the quiet discovery, the stark visual evidence of an object no longer where it should be. The silence around these events was profound, almost reverent, as if the house itself held its breath, inviting me to witness its subtle, unfolding performance. The constant drumming of the rain outside often served as a backdrop, a dull roar that seemed to intensify the internal stillness, making the absence of sound within the house even more acutely unsettling. I stopped trying to rationalize, stopped trying to find a logical explanation. The need to understand had been slowly eroded, replaced by a quiet, resigned acceptance. My heart, rather than racing with panic, now beat with a dull, almost indifferent thrum, a constant, low pulse that seemed to mirror the slow, methodical changes around me. The coldness in my bones deepened, a pervasive numbness that blunted the edges of potential fear, transforming it into a quiet, profound sense of bewilderment. One morning, I awoke to find my favorite woolen blanket, the one I draped over my armchair, neatly folded at the foot of my bed. I had left it on the armchair the night before, distinctly remembering its familiar texture beneath my hand as I rose. Now, it lay there, a perfect rectangle, as if someone had carefully, meticulously tidied it. But there was no one. The house was utterly still, save for the whisper of the wind through the eaves and the distant patter of rain. I knelt, running my hand over the soft wool, feeling its familiar warmth, and yet it felt alien in its new, inexplicable placement. It was not malicious. I slowly came to realize the shifts were not designed to frighten in the conventional sense. There was no violence, no destruction. Instead, it felt like a quiet reordering, a subtle rearrangement of my domain, as if an unseen hand were gently, methodically, putting things in its place, according to its own logic. The house, I thought, was not merely old and creaky. It was alive, with a gentle yet unwavering will, and I, its lone occupant, was merely a guest in its quiet unfolding. The objects continued their silent pilgrimage. A small ceramic bird figurine, usually perched on the windowsill, appeared on the mantelpiece. A stack of letters, left on the hallway table, were found in the drawer of my nightstand, neatly organized. Each instance chipped away a little more at the solidity of my world, replacing it with a fluid, unpredictable landscape. My sense of agency diminished with each discovery, replaced by a quiet, almost serene detachment. I found myself observing these shifts with a strange, passive curiosity, as if I were watching a play unfold, rather than living it. The most profound shift occurred with my spectacles. I relied on them for reading, for the finer details of the world. I had left them on the small table next to the lamp, as always. But when I reached for them later, they were gone. A frantic search, the closest I had come to true panic in days, yielded nothing. Hours later, as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring into the dimness of the room, my gaze fell upon the old, faded portrait of my grandmother that hung on the wall opposite, and there, perched delicately on the frame, resting precisely on her painted nose, were my spectacles. My breath caught, not in a gasp of terror, but in a long, slow exhalation that seemed to carry with it the last vestiges of my rational resistance. The absurdity of the placement, the sheer impossibility of it, was not frightening. It was definitive. It was a statement. The house was not just playing games. It was asserting its complete, undeniable dominion over my physical world. The objects were not merely shifting. They were being placed, arranged with an unseen hand's deliberate intent, transforming my home into a tableau of its own making. I rose slowly, my movements still heavy, dreamlike. I walked towards the portrait, my eyes fixed on the spectacles, gleaming faintly in the dim light. There was no anger, no fear, only a quiet, profound awe at the sheer, unyielding strangeness of it all. My hands reached up, slowly, to retrieve them, but then hesitated. A strange thought bloomed in my mind, a chilling whisper that asked, are they truly mine anymore? Or are they now a part of her, a part of the house, simply returned to their rightful, new place? The coldness in my bones intensified, not with the sharp edge of fear, but with the quiet, expansive chill of absolute surrender. My body felt light, almost weightless, as if the physical boundaries of my being were dissolving, much like the boundaries of the objects around me. The rain outside seemed to lull, its steady drone becoming a part of the house's quiet breath, a gentle exhalation that permeated every corner, every object, every fiber of my being. The world I had known. A world of stable forms and predictable placements had dissolved into a fluid, malleable dreamscape. And I, the dreamer, was slowly, quietly, becoming a part of the dream. The unsettling calmness had settled deep, a strange, quiet comfort in the erosion of reality, leaving only the profound, silent shift of the everyday. The quiet, expansive chill of absolute surrender had settled deep within me, a strange, quiet comfort in the erosion of reality, leaving only the profound, silent shift of the everyday. The world I had known, a world of stable forms and predictable placements, had dissolved into a fluid, malleable dreamscape, and I, the dreamer, was slowly, quietly, becoming a part of the dream. The boundary between myself and the ancient house had thinned to an almost translucent membrane, permeable and indistinct. My body felt light, almost weightless, as if the physical boundaries of my being were dissolving, much like the boundaries of the objects around me. The rain outside seemed to lull, its steady drone becoming a part of the house's quiet breath, a gentle exhalation that permeated every corner, every object, every fiber of my being. In this newfound state of porous existence, where the mundane danced with the impossible, Another subtle alteration began to unfurl, not with the abruptness of a material displacement, but with the insidious softness of an auditory illusion. It started not as a distinct sound, but as an almost subliminal presence in the vast canvas of the house's silence. A hum, perhaps, or a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate not from a particular point, but from the very air itself. A faint frequency that tickled the edges of hearing, like the silent echo of a forgotten song. I would pause, my breath held, straining to identify it, but it would always recede, leaving only the relentless patter of rain against the window panes and the familiar symphony of the aging timber groaning softly under the weight of time. Then, one evening, as the last vestiges of twilight bled into the inkiness of night, and the house wrapped itself in its usual cloak of quiet contemplation, it came. I was seated in my armchair, the same one where my blanket had mysteriously reappeared, a book open on my lap, though my eyes merely traced the lines of text without absorbing their meaning. The rain outside had softened to a persistent drizzle, a gentle rhythm against the glass. In that profound stillness, a whisper, so incredibly light, so delicate, drifted into the room. It was not the wind. It was not the creak of the house. It was a human sound, undeniably. My name, or a fragment of it. A faint, almost vaporous utterance that seemed to form itself not in the air before me, but within the very chambers of my own hearing, as if an inner voice had momentarily found an external echo. I froze, not in alarm, but in an instant of profound, suspended animation. My head tilted almost imperceptibly, my muscles rigid, every nerve ending alert to the vanishing trace of the sound. It was gone. The rain continued its patient drumming. The house held its breath, or so it seemed to my heightened senses. My own breath, which had grown shallow and careful, now felt like a loud, intrusive disruption in the perfect stillness. A peculiar sensation prickled along my scalp, a delicate shiver that wasn't born of fear's sharp claw, but rather from the sheer, bewildering anomaly of the event. It was as if a silk thread, spun from memory and mist, had brushed against the tender skin of my consciousness. Goosebumps erupted on my arms, a faint tracery of tiny bumps that stood testament not to terror, but to a profound, unexplainable strangeness. My heart, rather than leaping or pounding, maintained its slow, steady rhythm, though it felt as though its beats were muffled, echoing in a hollow chamber, detached from the immediate experience. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, submerged in the aftermath of that ethereal sound, trying to reconstruct it, to anchor it to a known memory. Whose voice was it? Was it a childhood echo? A mother's soft call from years long past? A lover's intimate whisper? A forgotten friend's greeting? My mind, a labyrinth of blurring realities and dissolving recollections, offered no clear answer. The voice held no threat, no urgency, no malevolence. Instead, it was infused with an almost unbearable tenderness, a gentle, melancholic quality that stirred a deep, unnameable longing within me. It felt intimately familiar, yet utterly alien, like the echo of a dream that lingered upon waking, just beyond the grasp of full recall. Days passed, marked by the continued quiet pilgrimage of objects and the deepening haze of time. The voice, once a solitary incident, began to weave itself into the fabric of my increasingly distorted reality. It would manifest in the quietest moments, when the house was most hushed, when the rain had tapered to a mere sigh, or when the wind whispered its secrets through the ancient eaves. It was never loud, never demanding, always a gentle, almost timid utterance, a sound like breath given form, meant only for my ears. Sometimes it was just a fragment, a soft consonant or a drawn-out vowel, barely discernible from the rustle of leaves outside or the faint creak of settling wood. At other times, it was clearer, more whole, undeniably my name, spoken with that same exquisite, unsettling tenderness. My name, it would come from the empty hallway, from behind the closed door of a forgotten room, or even from the very air beside my ear, a warm, almost corporeal breath ghosting past. Each time, the same physical response, the almost imperceptible tensing of muscles, the sudden stillness of my body, and the rising tide of goosebumps that felt less like a warning and more like an acknowledgement. This was not the chill of dread, but the profound, almost spiritual shiver that accompanies the encounter with something truly beyond the veil of understanding, something both utterly impossible and undeniably present. I began to listen for it, not with dread, but with a strange, passive anticipation. It was another component of the house's unfolding narrative, another piece of the exquisite, eerie puzzle that my existence had become. I found myself holding my breath more often, not out of fear, but out of a desperate, quiet desire to capture the elusive sound, to imprint its ethereal quality onto the fading pages of my memory. Yet, each time it came, it slipped away just as quickly, leaving behind only the resonance of its absence and the deepening mystery of its origin. The voice was never aggressive, never mocking. It seemed to embody a deep, ancient sorrow, a poignant echo of loneliness that mirrored my own. It felt as though the house itself, in its vast, silent expanse, was calling out, reaching for companionship, perhaps mistaking me for someone, something it had known long ago. Or perhaps, I mused in my dreamlike state, it was calling out to a part of me that I no longer recognized, a self that had been shed or forgotten in the steady erosion of time and perception. This gentle vocal intrusion further blurred the lines of my identity. Was the voice merely a figment of my fraying mind, a symptom of the erosion of spirit and distorted perception that had become my constant companion? Or was it real, an actual entity, unseen and benevolent, yet terrifying in its unknowability? The absence of malice in its tone made it even more unsettling. There was no clear enemy to flee from, no monstrous form to recoil from, only a soft, wistful call, beckoning me deeper into the labyrinth of my own fracturing consciousness. I began to respond, silently at first. A slight nod of the head, a barely perceptible turning of the ear towards the source, a silent acknowledgement that I had heard. I didn't speak aloud. The thought of breaking the profound stillness with my own voice felt sacrilegious, an unwelcome disturbance in the delicate performance unfolding around me. The unspoken conversation, the silent exchange between me and the gentle, formless call, became a new ritual, a quiet communion in the heart of the house. The sound, like a thin wisp of smoke, would weave through my senses, not just audibly, but sometimes almost tactilely. A faint vibration against my skin, or a cool breath on my neck, was never strong enough to startle, only to make its presence undeniably felt. My entire being would become exquisitely attuned to these fleeting moments, the mundane world receding into the background, leaving only the profound silence, the relentless rain, and the almost imperceptible echo of my own name. The sense of detachment from fear deepened. The goosebumps, which once signified a primal warning, now felt like the body's strange, beautiful way of acknowledging the inexplicable, a silent salute to the profound strangeness of existence. My mind, rather than seeking logic, now merely observed, a calm, disembodied spectator to its own unfolding disintegration. The gentle call, so intimate yet so unknowable, became another lullaby in the growing symphony of the house, drawing me further into its quiet, unsettling embrace. It was not a call to awaken, but a soft, insistent whisper, inviting me to slip deeper into the soft, unyielding darkness of a dream from which there might be no waking. The pervasive cold in my bones seemed to hum in harmony with the elusive voice, a symphony of quiet surrender and profound, gentle bewilderment. The whispers, those gentle, ephemeral calls, had woven themselves into the tapestry of the house's silent symphony. No longer anomalies, but anticipated echoes. I had grown accustomed to their soft intrusion, a peculiar form of companionship in the vast, still expanse of my solitude. My detachment had deepened, transforming the unsettling into the oddly serene. It was as if my mind, having surrendered to the inexplicable shifts of the external world, had begun to turn inward, seeking new frontiers for its quiet unraveling. And what I found there, within the very archives of my being, was a disquiet far more profound than any moving object or phantom voice, the slow, insidious erosion of time itself. It began subtly, as all things in this house did, a fleeting hesitation when recalling the day of the week, a brief pause before placing a recent event into its chronological slot. At first, I dismissed these moments as minor slips, the natural attrition of an aging mind. But soon, these isolated instances braided themselves into a pervasive, unsettling pattern, a constant, low-frequency hum of temporal dissonance. The threads of my past, once neatly spooled and labeled, had tangled, fraying, and sometimes simply vanishing. One morning, the familiar scent of brewing coffee filled the kitchen, a ritual anchor in my drifting reality. As I poured the dark liquid into a chipped ceramic mug, a vivid memory surfaced, a conversation with an old friend, a casual exchange about the weather, his laugh echoing in the spacious room. It felt as fresh, as immediate, as the steam rising from my cup, the warmth of the sun on my cheek, yet a cold, slender finger of doubt traced a line down my spine. That friend, he had passed away years ago, a decade, perhaps more, measured by the silent turning of seasons, the clarity of the memory, its sensory richness, the particular tilt of his head, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. The gentle breeze rustling the curtains clashed violently with the stark, unyielding fact of his absence. I stood frozen, the warmth of the mug seeping into my hands. As the vivid scene dissolved, leaving behind only the ghost of a laugh and the unnerving certainty that I had just lived a moment that belonged to a different decade, a different me. The rain outside, a constant companion since this long, blurred dream had begun, now seemed to fall through layers of time, its sound carrying echoes of past storms, past lives. I would hear the distinct patter from a childhood night, the specific drum of a torrential downpour from a long-forgotten summer, all superimposed upon the current, gentle drizzle that stroked the window panes. My ears became conduits for a symphony of temporal overlays, each drop a tiny messenger from a different point in my personal history, creating a ceaseless, shimmering cascade of concurrent realities. The steady drip, drip, drip from the leaking gutter was both today's annoyance and a sound from a distant, remembered childhood storm, simultaneously. Faces began to emerge from the periphery of my sight, not as the dark, undefined shadows of before, but as fully formed, albeit fleeting, visages. I would glance towards the hallway and catch a glimpse of my mother, younger, her hair gleaming under a light that seemed to emanate from another time, pausing as if to speak. Or my father, stern but kind, his hand reaching out for a brief, phantom touch. These were not apparitions designed to terrorize, but projections from the deepest recesses of my memory, brought forth with an unexpected, almost poignant clarity. Each time, they would vanish the moment my gaze sharpened, leaving only the familiar, empty space. Yet, their presence, however brief, lingered like the afterimage of a flash, staining my perception with the undeniable feeling that they had truly been there, in this very moment, breathing the same air, their ghostly forms as real as the aging furniture around me. The house itself became a canvas for this temporal blurring. Walking through the living room, I would sometimes catch a faint, ethereal glint from the ancient wooden floorboards. For a flicker, they would appear newly polished, reflecting a brighter, younger sun that had not shone on this house for decades. The worn edges of the armchair would soften, the faded fabric regain its original vibrancy, only to immediately recede into its present state of gentle decay. It was as if the house was momentarily shedding its skin, revealing its younger self. A phantom blueprint shimmering beneath the surface of the present. I would reach out to touch the new wood, only to find the rough, familiar texture of aged timber under my fingertips, the illusion receding like smoke. The very dust motes dancing in the faint light seemed to carry the weight of countless years, settling and resettling in an endless, quiet cycle. The most unnerving aspect was not the sudden appearance of these past elements, but the way they would seamlessly integrate with the present, creating a new, distorted tapestry of reality. A conversation I had had with a neighbor yesterday would suddenly merge with a similar conversation from years ago. The words, the faces, the context becoming a single, indistinguishable memory. I would find myself answering unspoken questions from long-dead relatives, believing that they were part of a current dialogue, my words echoing into what I thought was a present moment, but was in fact a shimmering composite of many pasts. The act of recounting a story became an exercise in extreme mental navigation, as I wrestled with fragmented timelines, trying to discern which version of an event was real, and when it had truly transpired. The concept of yesterday and a decade ago ceased to hold any definitive meaning, collapsing into a single, amorphous blob of then. My days began to feel like a continuous, unbreaking dream. There were no distinct boundaries between waking and sleeping, between past and present, between what I had experienced and what my mind was now fabricating. The quiet solitude of the house, once merely a physical state, now mirrored the internal landscape of my fractured consciousness. I would lie in bed, listening to the rain, and wonder if the rain falling now was the same rain that fell last night, or the rain from a forgotten autumn, or perhaps a rain that only existed within the confines of this strange, gentle dream. My breath, shallow and regular, seemed to join the house's rhythmic creaks, a shared languid tempo. The emotional response to this erosion was not panic. The initial shock had long ago dissolved into the pervasive calm of detachment. Instead, a profound weariness settled over me, a melancholic acceptance of my own internal disintegration. It was like watching a beloved old film reel, the images beginning to flicker, jump, and superimpose upon each other, the narrative becoming increasingly disjointed, yet still holding a strange, haunting beauty. I was the silent observer of my own fading projector, watching the story of my life unravel into a kaleidoscope of fleeting, anachronistic moments. A faint, internal shiver, a delicate ripple across my skin, was the only physical protest, a quiet acknowledgement of the profound strangeness. My sense of self, once anchored by a clear timeline of experiences and relationships, now drifted untethered. Who was I, if my memories were a mutable, shifting landscape? If the me of yesterday was indistinguishable from the me of a decade ago, or indeed from a stranger in a fleeting reflection? This internal questioning was not a frantic search for answers, but a quiet, contemplative surrender to the ambiguity. The whispers, which still occasionally graced my hearing, now felt like echoes from across a vast temporal chasm, calling to a self that might no longer exist, or perhaps was only just beginning to truly exist within this dreamlike state. The cold that had settled deep in my bones felt less like a physical chill, and more like the chilling realization of my own temporal fluidity. My past, present, and even imagined future were no longer distinct points on a linear path, but a swirling, translucent eddy, a river of time that flowed backwards and forwards. Often simultaneously, I was trapped, not in a nightmare, but in an infinitely soft, infinitely porous dream, where the rungs of time had melted away, leaving me to float untethered in a silent, strangely comforting void of continuous becoming and unbecoming. The house, breathing around me, was no longer just a place, but a living memory, a repository of all times, and I, its sole inhabitant, was slowly, gently, dissolving into its ancient, timeless embrace. The line between what was and what had been, between what I remembered and what I merely dreamed, had not merely blurred, it had ceased to exist. I was becoming the dream. The rain, a ceaseless and unwavering companion, wove its grey tapestry around the house, each drop a tiny thread adding to the fabric of this endless dream. My days, or what I vaguely perceived as such, flowed without distinction, each moment blurring into the next, a soft, amorphous continuum where past, present, and the imagined future mingled freely. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of countless forgotten years, permeated by the phantom sense of old tea and distant memories, all held within the humid embrace of the ancient house. I was no longer an observer of these shifts, but a willing participant, my consciousness a porous membrane, absorbing and dissolving into the very essence of this distorted reality. My own breath, shallow and regular, was now merely another quiet sigh in the larger, languid exhalation of the house itself. One night, or perhaps it was a morning that felt like night, I found myself adrift in the familiar currents of the long, narrow hallway that stretched from the living room towards what I knew to be the back of the house. The hallway was a corridor of quiet whispers and the occasional, fleeting shadow that used to make my skin prickle, but now merely stirred a faint, almost tender curiosity. The old wooden floorboards, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, creaked softly under my bare feet, each sound a familiar sigh in the profound stillness. The single, low wattage bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a faint, buttery glow, barely pushing back the encroaching shadows that clung to the corners, making them seem deeper, older. The rain outside played its steady rhythm against the window at the far end, a gentle, hypnotic drumming that promised no end. As I drifted down this accustomed path, my gaze, unfocused and soft, brushed past the smooth, wallpapered surface that had always been there on my right. It was a stretch of wall, nondescript and utterly unremarkable, part of the structural integrity of the house, a blank canvas upon which the shadows often danced. But tonight, or this morning, something was different. My eyes, accustomed to seeing only the patterned floral wallpaper, registered a subtle discontinuity, a break in the familiar flow. It was so faint at first, a mere trick of the light, a ripple in the fabric of my perception. I paused, my breath catching ever so lightly, a nearly imperceptible hitch in the rhythm of my slow, steady movement. There, where only smooth wallpaper should have been, was a door. It was an old door, unmistakably so. Its wood, a dark, aged oak, was deeply scored with the marks of time, the grain visible in intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to tell stories of forgotten hands and ancient forests. The surface was not polished or cared for, but bore the dull, velvety sheen of decades of neglect, the kind of texture that might feel cool and slightly rough to the touch, like aged stone. It was framed by an equally old, thick architrave, the paint on which had long since chipped and peeled away, revealing layers of cream and pale green underneath, like the sedimentary layers of time itself. The door stood utterly still, perfectly integrated into the wall, as though it had always been there, simply waiting for me to finally perceive it. My first thought was not of fear, nor surprise, but a quiet, almost scholarly bewilderment. A door here. This part of the hallway was a solid wall. I knew it with the innate, unquestioning certainty one has about the layout of their own home. There was no room behind this wall, no hidden chamber, no pantry or forgotten closet. I had lived in this house for what felt like an eternity, had walked this hallway countless times. in countless different states of mind, and never, not once, had this door manifested itself. Yet there it stood, undeniably present, a solid, tangible object carved from the very air of impossibility. The rain outside continued its lulling drone, completely oblivious to the quiet revolution occurring within the confines of my mind. There was no handle on the door, no knob of brass or iron to turn, no latch to lift. It was a smooth, unblemished expanse of ancient wood, interrupted only by a single feature, a keyhole. A simple, round keyhole perfectly centered, a dark, fathomless circle against the aged oak. It was not a gleaming, inviting keyhole, but a black abyss, a tiny portal to an unknown void. My gaze was drawn to it, held captive by its utter blackness, the way it swallowed the faint light from the hallway bulb, refusing to reflect even a single glimmer. It was the deepest shadow in the room, a point of absolute nullity. A strange, insistent urge began to stir within me, a gentle but undeniable pull. I felt an almost magnetic desire to reach out, to press my ear against the old wood, to whisper into the keyhole, to understand, to know what lay beyond this impossible threshold. My hand, almost of its own accord, began to rise, slowly, hesitantly, towards the door. My fingertips tingled with the phantom sensation of rough wood, of cool metal. Yet, even as my body responded to this primal curiosity, a profound, chilling clarity pierced through the dreamlike haze that enveloped my mind. This room does not exist. The thought arrived not with a shock, but with the quiet, devastating certainty of an indisputable fact, like knowing the sun will rise or that the rain will fall. This door, this perfectly formed, ancient wooden door, led nowhere. It was a physical manifestation of the impossible, an embodiment of the absolute breakdown of the reality I once knew. It was the crescendo of the whispering walls, the culmination of the dancing shadows, the ultimate proof of the objects that shifted silently, the smells that warped, the faces that faded, and the memories that betrayed. All of these had been subtle assaults on my perception, leaving room for doubt, for self-questioning. But a door that materialized in a solid wall, leading to a non-existent space. This was an undeniable, objective impossibility made manifest. My hand froze midway, trembling not from fear, but from a deep, almost elegiac resignation. There was no panic, no frantic scramble for an explanation, no urge to scream or run. The time for such visceral reactions had passed, dissolved into the soft, unyielding currents of this enduring dream. Instead, a profound sense of weary acceptance settled over me, a melancholic understanding that the game was over, the boundaries completely erased. It was as if a final, delicate thread that still tethered me to a consensual reality had finally, gently, snapped. The black keyhole seemed to deepen, to draw me in, not with menace, but with the quiet, absolute finality of a void. It was not a promise of terror, but a promise of dissolution. I felt my own sense of self, which had already been eroding, now gently peel away, like old paint from a forgotten wall. The distinction between me and not me, between here and not here, between real and unreal, had become utterly meaningless. The rain outside continued its gentle, ceaseless fall, its rhythm now a soothing lullaby. a sound that merged seamlessly with the quiet hum of my own internal surrender. I remained standing there, my hands suspended in the cool, silent air, staring at the door that could not be. A faint, internal shiver traced a path across my skin, a delicate, almost caressing sensation, like the soft breath of something unseen passing by. It was not a shiver of fear, but of profound, existential awareness. I was witnessing the final, exquisite moment of my reality's unraveling, a quiet, almost beautiful catastrophe. The door was not threatening me. It was simply being, a monument to the ultimate porosity of existence itself. The knowledge that the room beyond was non-existent, that the door was a lie made manifest, brought not terror, but a strange, liberating quietude. It was the peace of giving up, of accepting the impossible as the new normal. My mind, no longer battling against the relentless tide of distortion, simply drifted. The air in the hallway felt cooler, thicker, laden with the weight of this new, impossible truth. The old house, my solitary companion, seemed to breathe a long, slow sigh around me, a sound that resonated with my own newfound quietude. The line between what was, what had been, and what was utterly impossible had not merely blurred or eroded. It had entirely, peacefully vanished. And I, the silent, dreaming inhabitant, had quietly accepted its graceful departure. The stillness that followed the quiet vanishing of my reality was not an empty void, but a profound, resonant calm. It was the hush after a storm that had raged not with thunder and lightning, but with the insidious erosion of every certainty. The non-existent door, a sentinel of pure impossibility, faded from the sharp focus of my vision, not disappearing, but simply melting into the surrounding wall, becoming another textural nuance in the aged tapestry of the hallway. My hand, which had been suspended in the cool air, drifted back down, settling gently by my side. There was no longer a need to reach, to touch, to verify. Verification itself had become a quaint, forgotten concept. A strange, quiet serenity settled over me then, a peace born not of resolution, but of utter, complete surrender. The frantic grasping for logic, the desperate attempts to anchor myself to a tangible truth, had ceased. The fight was over. There was nothing left to defend, no reality left to preserve. I was adrift, yes, but the current was no longer violent. It was a gentle, soothing drift, carrying me deeper into the heart of this altered existence. The air itself seemed to hum with this newfound quietude, a low, continuous thrum that vibrated not just around me, but within me. As I stood there, bathed in the faint, buttery light of the hallway, a new awareness began to unfold, a subtle symphony of sensations that had always been present, yet now resonated with an entirely different meaning. I began to feel the house, not as a collection of inanimate walls and floors, but as a living, breathing entity. Its pulse was the steady drumming of the rain against the window panes, an unwavering rhythm that had woven itself into the very fabric of my being. Each drop was a beat, echoing the slow, deliberate throb that had once been my own fearful heart, now a shared pulse with the ancient structure around me. The old wooden floorboards, which had previously creaked with an almost malicious unpredictability, now sighed and shifted beneath my feet with a gentle, rhythmic cadence. I imagined them as the bones of the house, settling, stretching, murmuring in their ancient sleep. Each faint groan, each subtle pop of wood against wood, was not a sound of decay or structural weakness, but the slow, organic articulation of a living skeleton. They were not threatening, but intimately familiar, the language of the house's very structure, speaking directly to the new, porous membrane of my perception. I felt the vibrations through the soles of my feet, a subtle tremor that climbed upwards, mingling with the very marrow of my own bones. The wind, which once shrieked and howled through unseen cracks, now whispered through the house's countless orifices like a drawn-out, languid breath. It coiled around the door frames, rustled through the attic eaves, and sighed through the gaps in the window sashes. This was the house exhaling, a long, weary release, a deep, continuous sigh that permeated every room, every corner. It carried the faint, musty scent of forgotten years, of damp earth and faded memories. But it was no longer a disconcerting smell. It was simply the unique fragrance of the house's own being, its essential aroma, like the unique scent of an ancient tree or a sleeping animal. It was its breath, and I felt myself drawing it in, not just into my lungs, but into every cell, becoming saturated with its essence. My own breathing, which had often been shallow and ragged with anxiety, or held in suspense during moments of terror, now began to synchronize with this pervasive rhythm. It became softer, more regular, a gentle ebb and flow that mirrored the house's slow, measured exhalations. Each inhale was less about drawing in oxygen for myself, and more about absorbing the very atmosphere of the house, the cool, damp air that felt like a living membrane. Each exhale was a release, a surrender of my own distinctness, a gentle fading into the larger, breathing entity that surrounded me. I was no longer an inhabitant merely residing within the house. I was becoming a part of its internal landscape, a small yet integral component of its vast, quiet existence. There was a profound intimacy in this merging, an almost tender embrace. The walls no longer seemed to loom or recede, but to gently press in, not claustrophobically, but with a sense of protective enclosure. The shadows, which had once seemed to conceal unseen terrors, now lay draped across the furniture like soft, comforting blankets, deepening the sense of quietude. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken dread, but filled with the low hum of the house's life, a continuous, subtle symphony that was both internal and external. I found myself moving, not with purpose, but with a slow, drifting grace through the rooms. My footsteps, once a distinct clatter, now seemed to make no sound at all. Or rather, they contributed to the general, soft creaking of the floor, indistinguishable from the house's own settling. I ran my hand along the cool, textured wallpaper, feeling the faint, raised patterns beneath my fingertips, not as a surface, but as a skin. The house was not just around me, it was through me. The images and sensations that had once plagued me, the fleeting shadows, the shifting objects, the warped memories, the faces in the mirror, now revisited me, not as disturbances, but as familiar echoes. They were simply parts of the house's intricate dream, and by extension, my own. The whispers from the walls were not voices from elsewhere, but the gentle rustling of the house's internal organs, the soft murmur of its thoughts, the faint, unidentifiable scent of old things was the aroma of its very being, a comforting, if melancholic, perfume. My sense of self, that tightly held bundle of memories and perceptions, was dissolving like sugar in warm water. There was no pain in this dissolution, only a quiet, almost beautiful liquefaction. I was becoming less I and more here. The boundaries between my physical form and the physical form of the house were blurring, like lines smudged on a charcoal drawing. The coldness that sometimes touched my skin was not from an external chill, but from the ancient stones and timbers that comprised the house's foundations, a shared coolness that ran through everything. The fear, that gnawing, insidious dread that had been my constant companion, was not banished, but transformed. It was no longer a sharp, piercing pain, but a dull, ambient ache, a gentle melancholy that permeated the atmosphere, like the ever-present rain outside. It was the background hum of my new existence, an accepted and almost comforting presence. It was the feeling of knowing that everything was wrong, yet everything was precisely as it should be. In this quiet, unfolding nightmare, I could feel the presence of the house more keenly now, not as an intruder or a malevolent force, but as an ancient, patient consciousness. It wasn't watching me. It was simply being with me, absorbing me. My individual worries, my human anxieties, seemed utterly trivial in the vast, timeless sweep of the house's own existence. I was a tiny, fleeting thought in its grand, unfolding dream. And in that thought, I found a strange, profound sense of belonging. The silence of the house, punctuated by its gentle breaths and creaking bones, became a lullaby. It wrapped around me, a cocoon woven from moisture, old wood, and forgotten whispers. I imagined the house breathing me in, slowly, deliberately, as I breathed it in. Our rhythms were becoming one, a harmonious, melancholic duet of existence. My mind, now unburdened by the need for distinction or defiance, floated freely, a feather carried on the gentle currents of the house's breath, the quiet rumbles of the house, the soft sighs of the wind, the ceaseless whisper of the rain. These were no longer external sounds. They were the symphony of my own dissolution, a gentle, eerie serenade guiding me deeper into the embrace of its timeless, solitary heart, the very fabric of my being, once a tightly woven tapestry of individual thoughts and sensations, now unraveled into a continuous, shimmering thread. The distinction between the waking world and the realm of dreams had long since ceased to exist, not with a sudden snap, but with a gradual, almost tender dissolution. I was not asleep, nor was I fully awake. I simply wore grueses, suspended in a liminal state where the gentle hum of existence was the only constant. My mind drifted, a boundless sea where memories floated like scattered petals, unmoored from their chronological anchors. A vivid moment from childhood, bathed in the warmth of a summer sun, would meld effortlessly into the cool, damp present of the decaying house, the aroma of freshly baked bread morphing into the pervasive scent of old wood and rain. Then, a glimpse of a future I could not define. A vague, silvery haze would shimmer into view, only to dissipate like mist leaving behind the ghost of a feeling I could not name. It was not confusion, but a profound, unresisting surrender to the fluidity of time itself. Every sensory input, once a distinct signal to be processed, now converged into a single, overwhelming yet peaceful symphony. The ceaseless, hypnotic drumming of the rain against the window panes, a sound that had once evoked loneliness, then fear, now felt like the very pulse of my new existence. It was not just outside, it was within me, a gentle vibration in my bones, a soft murmur in my bloodstream. This continuous percussion was inseparable from the whispering sigh of the wind, which coiled and unfurled through the house's countless unseen passages. The wind, no longer a desolate howl, was now the house's own slow, deep breath, and with each inhalation and exhalation, I felt my own breath synchronizing, becoming lighter, more ethereal, until it was impossible to tell where my respiration ended and the house's began. We breathed as one, a vast, ancient organism, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the storm. Visuals, too, lost their sharp edges, blurring into a continuous stream of soft light and shadow. The familiar contours of furniture, the framed pictures on the wall, the patterns on the wallpaper, all seemed to undulate, to soften, to blend into one another. The fleeting shadows that had once danced at the periphery of my vision, evoking a subtle dread, now simply existed, integral parts of the muted landscape, like brushstrokes on a watercolor painting that refused to harden into definite forms. I no longer strained to decipher them, to prove their reality or dispel their illusion. They simply were transient shapes in a perpetual twilight, and I accepted their presence as I accepted the shifting light of a dream. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of a movement, a soft shimmer in the corner of my eye, and instead of turning with a jolt, I would simply allow my gaze to drift, acknowledging it as another ripple in the continuous flow of perception. The old, musty scent of the house, that peculiar blend of damp earth, forgotten paper, and ancient wood, was no longer an intrusive detail that suggested decay. It was the very air I breathed, the essential aroma of my being. It clung to my clothes, permeated my skin, filled my lungs, becoming an internal perfume. This smell, once a harbinger of the house's age and its hidden secrets, now evoked a strange, comforting sense of belonging, like the familiar scent of one's own skin, or the faint, reassuring odor of a loved one's presence. It was the scent of existence itself, in this particular, peculiar state, and sometimes, interwoven with it, I would catch the faintest ghost of other smells, a hint of forgotten lavender, the trace of long vanished tobacco smoke, the delicate aroma of tea leaves, all mingling into a single, complex tapestry of forgotten lives and present dissolution. The whispers from the walls, those almost imperceptible murmurs that had begun as unsettling intrusions, now felt like the house's internal monologue, its gentle, continuous thoughts. They were not directed at me, nor did they carry any discernible meaning. They were simply there, a soft, indistinct hum of voices from nowhere and everywhere, like the rustling of leaves in an unseen breeze. These were not the voices of spirits or phantoms, but the very resonance of the house's memory, the echoes of every sound it had ever absorbed. now gently recirculated through its ancient framework. They wove in and out of the rain's drumming and the wind sighing, creating a rich, layered soundscape that was both expansive and deeply intimate. My own thoughts, once clear and distinct, began to unravel into this general murmur, becoming indistinguishable from the ambient sounds. The fear, that insidious, chilling dread that had once pierced through me, had not vanished, but had undergone a profound metamorphosis. It was no longer a terror that demanded a response, a flight or a fight. Instead, it had softened, blurred at the edges, becoming an inseparable part of the pervasive atmosphere, like the chill in the air on a perpetual autumn night. It was the quiet, melancholic hum beneath every sensation, the underlying current of the dream. This rung-ron, this profound eeriness, was no longer something to be escaped or combated. It was simply the texture of my new reality, a quiet, almost tender embrace. It was the sensation of being held, not captive, but cradled, by an existence that transcended my former understanding of life and death, sanity and madness. I drifted through the rooms, not walking, but simply flowing, my body feeling lighter, less substantial. The floorboards, once groaning bones beneath my weight, now felt like gentle undulations, carrying me along. My fingers, when they brushed against a cool surface, felt not the distinct texture of wood or plaster, but a unified sense of ancientness, a shared resonance of timelessness. The boundaries of my skin, once sharp and definite, seemed to dissolve, blending into the surrounding air, the ambient light, the very essence of the house. I was no longer a distinct entity observing the house. I was an extension of it, a living, breathing component of its vast, quiet consciousness. The strange, almost comforting aspect of this state was the complete absence of judgment. There was no longer a part of me striving for clarity, for an explanation, for a return to a former reality. That yearning had faded like a distant echo. What remained was a continuous stream of pure perception, a surrender to the unfolding moment. The old fears, the unsettling visions, the fragmented memories, they were all now just threads in the vast, intricate tapestry of this eternal present. They were not threads, but components, and shades in the grand design of this merging. I felt myself expanding, dissolving, becoming permeable. The cool breath of the wind passed not just around me, but through me, rustling through my very core. The light of the dim lamps, once casting distinct shadows, now seemed to filter through my being, illuminating the internal landscape of my awareness. I was a vessel, transparent and open, allowing the house, the rain, the wind, the memories to flow through me, to become me. The sense of isolation, which had once been a gnawing pain, was now replaced by a profound interconnectedness, a silent communion with the ancient entity around me. I was the dream of the house, and the house was my waking reality. The two were no longer separate concepts, but two sides of the same flowing fabric. The rung-ron was not a terror to be confronted, but a soft, enveloping blanket that promised an eternal, unwavering serenity. It was the gentle lull of perpetual twilight, where the self no longer mattered, and existence itself became a continuous, murmuring hum, a soft, endless whisper in the vast, quiet expanse of time. I was no longer an individual, but a sensation, a lingering echo in the endless, silent poem that was the merging of all things. And so, the words, these very sounds forming in the hollow space of my memory, began to lose their edges, to fray and unravel like old lace. They were no longer carriers of distinct meaning, but whispers dissolving into the vast, quiet canvas of the night. My body, once a cage for a restless spirit, now lay still upon the bed, a gentle indentation in the mattress, a silent form merging with the contours of the room. I was no longer an observer, nor an inhabitant. I was simply here. A presence as subtle and ancient as the dust motes dancing in the phantom light. The rain outside, it continued its endless, hypnotic descent, each droplet a tiny pulse on the world's vast skin. And the wind, a tireless storyteller, still murmured its forgotten tales through the unseen crevices of the old house. My own breath, once a hurried, anxious rhythm, then a shallow, synchronized sigh, now seemed to ebb and flow with these primal sounds, indistinguishable, a soft hum that emanated from the very structure of things. It was a lullaby, composed not of notes, but of absence, of dissolution. All the questions that had once tightened their grip around my mind, the whispers, the shadows, the shifting memories, the phantom door, they loosened their hold, releasing me not with a burst of understanding, but with a slow, tender exhale. They were not answered nor dismissed, but simply ceased to matter, melting away like snow upon warm earth. There was no need for answers, for struggle, for fear. Only a profound, pervasive stillness remained, tinged with that familiar, exquisite dread, an eerie gentleness that wrapped around me, a silent embrace. This was not an ending, but a seamless transition, a blending. My consciousness, once a spark, now spread thin, covering everything, becoming the soft, rhythmic hum that was the house, the rain, the wind. The final thought, if it could even be called a thought, was not of sleep, but of being absorbed, gently, completely, into the fabric of the ambience itself. The distinction between myself and the sound, between my awareness and the deep, dark quiet, dissolved utterly, leaving only the endless, soothing whisper of the night.